Our first speaker for today is Dr. Liat Ben Moshe, who is an associate professor of criminology, law, and justice at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She is the author of Decarcerating Disability, Deinstitutionalization and Prison Abolition, and co-editor of Disability Incarcerated, Imprisonment and Disability in the United States and Canada. She is an activist scholar working at the intersection of incarceration, abolition, and disability madness. For more information about her work, you can visit her website at www.liatbenmoshe.com. The paper title is Abolition and Crip Mad of Color Critiques. You have the floor. We're excited.
Thank you, Zoom. So first of all, thank you all for inviting me, and congratulations for your first inaugural, which will hopefully be continuous, useful, ceremonial, but hopefully also action-filled committee. And so congratulations for that. And I'm really glad that you've asked me and us to partake in that. There's only one first, right? So this is really exciting. So whatever happens next, you know, the queer arts or failure and all that, you know, we're still bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. And, you know, like I said, there's only one first. First of all, I wanted to, in addition to like, thank you, Joel mentioned that this presentation will be on for like ever in conference time. So it's being recorded. And so I just wanted to say in relation to the Q&A section, you know, feel free to ask anything, but also don't feel, you know, kind of like obligated, but also feel free to ask other people's questions, like imaginary people. I'm not sure. I think philosophers do this, right? Like you imagine scenarios and people, and then you're, I don't know. I don't actually know what philosophers do. But if you do that, then feel free to do that from me as well. And I will share screen. I decided to do it with slides, so you can kind of follow along. So there's some visuals and so on. So let's see. So first, I wanted to say that I'm in Chicago, as Stephanie mentioned, which is the traditional territory of the three fire people, the Ojibwe, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi, amongst others as well. And it's really important for me to say that because when I talk about today about Crip med of color analysis, I think that a lot of it also is related to, you know, BIPOC more generally, right? So Black, Indigenous, POC, and so on. So even if I don't say that a lot in the presentation, this is what I mean by of color. So I kind of renamed it Crip med of color analysis of abolition. And I will start the presentation. And the reason is that it's really important, especially for people who don't know my work and the work of people that I closely associate with, is that incarceration has been very much on the radar, I think, for a lot of people, particularly mass incarceration in the US, but not so much the disability aspects of it. And so a lot of my work has been about trying to understand incarceration and abolition, which is what I'll focus on today, as a disability justice issue. And again, this is like a little bit, the first slides here are kind of like a primer. A lot of this work comes from the book, Disability Incarcerated. But for today, I really tried to focus on this question of abolition, and particularly the the connection to deinstitutionalization, what led to, well, you'll see. But my point is that a lot of it, again, like comes directly from the book, but the work is much broader. Not just my work, but the work that that a lot of colleagues are doing. And what we're trying to do is really, again, push for a particular kind of disability lens within the framework of incarceration and abolition, because we believe that discussing mass incarceration and decarceration or abolition without referring to disability avoids an understanding of it as an analytical category. So more specifically, it kind of bypasses the whole field of disability studies and med studies, which is incredibly problematic, and you'll see today why. Disability, it also avoids understanding disability as a way to view the world. So in the book, I really try to focus, and that's what I'm going to do today, on disability as a lived experience. So the experience of disability as a politicized identity, particularly the social movements that are connected to disability, into psychiatry, med movements, consumer survivors, ex-patients, self-advocacy, neurodiversity, and so on. And the reason for people who don't understand what I mean by politicized identity, what I mean by that is that, you know, even myself as a disabled person, so this is really, I have to say, like, Zoom has been like so interesting in the past, you know, almost 2 years, because I'm a very visibly disabled person, but not on Zoom. So unless I come out, you know, kind of as disabled on Zoom, nobody would kind of know. But I want to say that as a disabled person, I didn't know I was, you know, I wasn't politicized as a disabled person until much later in my life. And I think this is true to a lot of people with disabilities and a lot of med people, a lot of neurodiverse people, and so on. And what I mean by disability is not disability as a deficit, but again, as an identity and as a way to inform policy and activist resolution to great social problems. Basically, what I mean is, how do we understand disability as a culture, as an identity, but also as a history, right? What is our connection to these history of struggle and history of resistance? And particularly here, I'm talking in relation to incarceration and abolition. I'm talking about the deinstitutionalization movement. So what do I mean by, if we're talking about a Crip or med of color analysis of incarceration, I thought I would do just a short overview of what I mean by that before I give you actually the examples of what I'm trying to say. And again, deinstitutionalization is going to be the focus of my talk. So for people who are more interested in kind of what goes on in prisons, just ask me in the Q&A. So this idea of our framework of Crip or med of color analysis comes from people like Kathy Cohen and Dean Spade, and especially Rod Ferguson, that of course coined the term queer of color analysis. And they talk about queer of color analysis as a way to question traditional white liberal approaches to problems such as calls to incorporate LGBTQ people in the army, or you know, marriage inequality, or things like that. But instead, they urge us to understand these social issues through an intersectional lens that has a broader analysis and a more radical analysis to what we come to call freedom and what liberation might be or look like. So taking that a step further, a few of us, I want to mention Robert McClure with Crip theory, and particularly Gina Kim with the who's done you know, initial work on this framework of Crip of color analysis. And I want to take that into the world of incarceration to ask, okay, so what does a Crip or med of color critique of incarceration or abolition look like? And what it looks like to me is that, first of all, it's really important to recognize the high number of disabled people in these carceral systems, like policing, prisons, institutions, and so on. Very high numbers. But I want to mention, like I did earlier, that it's not just about people who are politicized as disabled people or disabled people of color who go under this framework. So when I say Crip or men of color analysis, I don't just mean analysis that comes from people who self-identify as Crip or mad of color. To me, people don't have to identify as that in order for us to analyze a system as that. And this systemic analysis is what I'm going to, try to propose to you all today, and what I try to do in the book. It's about centering the experiences of disablement and ableism in criminal, racial, and social justice movements in the broader systems of oppression, of course. And disablement and ableism are not exactly the same as people who identify as, right? People don't have to identify as in order to experience ableism. By connecting the work of prison abolitionists and theorists to disability, we can understand how criminalizing entails the construction of both race, especially Blackness, and disability, especially mental difference, as dangerous. And we can understand how anti-Black racism is composed of pathologization and dangerousness, which leads to processes of criminalization and disablement. For instance, constructing people as other or deranged or crazy or scary, which is what leads to a lot of police murders of disabled people. So to me, one cannot separate a race from disability and vice versa. So when I say disability and you're thinking white people in wheelchairs, that's not what I'm talking about. So to me, disability already has an understanding of race in it, especially when we talk about analysis of incarceration and abolition. And this intersectional understanding is not just about analysis, but it's a framework, hopefully, for abolition and liberation. And one of my examples is deinstitutionalization. So why deinstitutionalization? The slide, by the way, I think it's one of the only slides that has an image, and this is an image of the cover of my book, Decarcerating Disability, for people who can't see the images. So why am I talking about deinstitutionalization? Well, there's many reasons, but one of them is that when I talk about abolition, when a lot of us talk about abolition, some people say, well, I follow your analysis, I understand your critique, but surely it cannot be done. So it's not prescriptive, it doesn't really offer any alternative. You're telling us to abolish, but what do you want instead? It represents a utopian vision of the world. It's unrealistic. I mean, maybe in the future, but surely you're not talking about right now. And it would only work in smaller countries. Usually people say Sweden or something, even though I don't think they understand Sweden at all, but whatever. But my point is that it did happen. And it happened in the US. And it happened in some of our lifetimes. If people are watching that are super young, then your parents maybe, lifetimes. So abolition of carceral spaces is not a utopian dream for the future, but it's something that has already happened in the US and in Canada in the form of deinstitutionalization in the field of mental health and intellectual disability. And so we can learn from it about prison abolition. But also, I think there's a lot of lessons in deinstitutionalization that we need to understand on their own term. So what is deinstitutionalization? Again, like I said earlier, I'm starting with kind of a very broad overview, but I am going to get into the nitty-gritty specifics in a moment. So my definition of deinstitutionalization, the first part of the definition might be like similar to other people's, which is it's about the closure, literal closing down of psychiatric hospitals or what we call asylums, but also large state institutions for people with intellectual disabilities. And I think that's how most people define deinstitutionalization. It's also about moving people with psychiatric or intellectual developmental disability labels from these institutions into community living. So it's not just let's close the space, it's also let's not move people to another institution by another name, but people need to be living in the community with all the resources that entails. And thirdly, and this is what I add to the kind of more traditional definitions, is that to me, deinstitutionalization, there has been a streak in it, not all of it, but a streak in it that has been abolitionary. And I view deinstitutionalization as a social movement, as a non-segregation mindset, as a logic, as an ideological shift in how we treat difference. Or at least this is what people who fought for deinstitutionalization wanted. So again, this is where it differs a little bit. So what led to deinstitutionalization? In the book, I construct a genealogy of deinstitutionalization, but I want to say that what a genealogy based on Foucault's understanding of genealogy, of course. I want to say that I'm not going to answer this question today in a lot of detail. There's whole chapters in the book that are related to the question of what led to deinstitutionalization, but I just want to say that it already occurred by the time it was named, which is really, part of, I think, being a genealogist is to buy into the kind of hegemonic story around, okay, deinstitutionalization happened because of Thorazine, like psychiatric drugs. Deinstitutionalization happened because of, blah, blah, blah. So in the book, I call it more like a perfect storm. There was a lot of things that happened, and some of them happened around the same time, and some of them actually happened decades apart. And all of those things created a kind of perfect storm that led to this thing that today or later we called deinstitutionalization. It wasn't like people sat in a room and were like, okay, how do we do this thing? How do we do it well? How do we do it differently? This is not how this happened, like at all. And so I think it's really important to understand that. And the second thing, before I get to the actual answer of what led to deinstitutionalization, I want to make sure that everybody here understands that when I say deinstitutionalization, I don't just mean deinstitutionalization in mental health. So when people say deinstitutionalization, they usually mean in their head the closure of asylums, like the psychiatric hospitals. You might be seeing in your head like the cuckoo's nest, and all of those things. And wow, how amazing, we closed it down, all that. And I do think that that's part of what happened in deinstitutionalization. But there's actually been an accompanying shift in relation to the movements of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and the closure of large state institutions of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the US and Canada. And I think that it's really important that we hold both of those at the same time in our head. But I also want to say that they did not happen at the same time historically. So the deinstitutionalization of people who were labeled as mentally ill, the population started to decline in the mid-50s. And the deinstitutionalization really happened more in the 60s, ideologically and so on. But in the field of intellectual and developmental disabilities, it really didn't gain prominence until about the 70s, and then more in the 80s. So there was about a 10, 15-year difference between those two forms of deinstitutionalization. But I do want people to understand and not leave behind all the knowledge, the rich knowledge and history and resistance movements that came from people with intellectual disabilities, because I think that historically we do that. We just think about kind of the field of mental health, and we kind of hold these, kind of some iconic figures in our heads, but this was a very, very profound difference. Very difference, I mean, the shift between institutional living and community living in that field as well. So there's been a lot of factors leading to deinstitutionalization, and I'm not going to explain them today. I'm just going to name them by words. Again, I have whole chapters about this in the book, but I want to bring you to a more specific point about abolition. And I want to bring you to a more specific point about Crip and Mad of color critique of abolition. And in order to do that, I want to just name, but not explain, the different factors that led to deinstitutionalization. And again, in the book, I also talk about how there wasn't really one factor that I think led to deinstitutionalization. There was just a combination of like a lot of things together. So for example, federal programs and policies, I think people tend to I should say that I'm doing this for all of you, maybe because I don't know how much philosophers know about social policy, but this might be like incredibly not useful information. So I'm just gonna like mention these things, but I'm not sure people are aware that things like Medicare and Medicaid are pretty new. I mean, they started in 1965. And so this is one of the factors, obviously, that led to deinstitutionalization because it decreased the reliance on long forms of hospitalization and institutionalization. But it also creates this kind of institutional bias by which money doesn't follow the person who's disabled, but the money goes to the institution itself. A lot of people mention psychotropic medication or psychopharmaceutical, and particularly the story of Thorazine. I talk a lot in the book about how that story, the hegemonic story, is we really need to problematize it. And Thorazine was a drug that was used to improve institutionalization, not deinstitutionalization. And I discuss why it's really dangerous, actually, to think about psychopharmaceutical as forms of liberating people out of institutions. Happy to talk about it in the Q&A. But for now, just remember drugs, social policy, Medicare, Medicaid. There was a lot of court litigation. I have a whole chapter in the book about this. But basically what happened with these class action lawsuits in institutions is that they mandated institutions to increase their quality of care, and in effect made them more expensive. They were too costly to maintain, and that led to their closure. But there was a huge time lag in this. I mean, these court litigation led to the closure of these institutions sometimes like 20, 30 years after the litigation started. So this was not kind of like a cause and effect, like people said, or court litigation led to the institutionalization. It didn't. There was also, of course, austerity, welfare cutbacks, neoliberalism. This is what really happened in the 70s and 80s, right? I mean, Reagan became president, introduced this new policy of neoliberalism that came from Thatcher. What it did is that it cut social services while increasing spending on corrections and punishment. So we see here the decline in institutions and then the rise of prisons happening around the same time. And the spending on mental health was decreased and eviscerated. The only thing that was left and is left today is biopsychiatry. The whole notion of community mental health that was supposed to be built never truly materialized. So it was not an ideological shift in how we treat disability, which is my definition of deinstitutionalization. It was a divestment from human needs. The role of exposés, I think, is really important to mention. There's something, by the way, going on with my Zoom, but if anything, so if I don't think I can see the chat, but if anything, if you don't see or hear me or anything like that, just unmute. If one of you can just unmute and let me know. Okay, so the role of exposés, a lot of people put a lot of emphasis on exposés as something that led to deinstitutionalization. And the reason why I want to focus on it for a second before I move on to my point and then kind of move on towards concluding is that we see that a lot today, actually, exposés. And I think a lot of people put a lot of energy into exposing conditions in institutions and in prisons. For example, with COVID, we see that a lot now. That thinking that, okay, the way to decarcerate people, the way to deinstitutionalize people is if we only show people what's really going on, you know, inside nursing homes and prisons, and what's going on with people getting COVID and, you know, the risk of COVID, then surely people will listen and this will happen. And I hate to say it, but it didn't happen. I mean, we're in year 2 of COVID. This has not worked as a strategy in its major way. And I think that we can learn from deinstitutionalization about why didn't it work, which is my point, which I'm getting to now. So exposés in institutions and asylums became more widespread during and after World War II. largely because of the placement of conscientious objectors in hospitals and institutions, because they chose civil service instead of military service. And then they were so shocked with what they saw that they started writing exposés on it, especially in the 40s and 50s. But expose-driven reforms only resulted in change in the degree of squalor, but the qualities of the institution essentially remained intact. It did have, I want to say, the lawsuits, the exposés, the riots in prisons, in institutions. It's not that they're completely not effective. They had a cumulative effect, and they brought to the public imagination the horrible conditions in institutions. My point for you all today is that this didn't do nothing. It did a lot, including politicized people, including people who were disabled, and that's great. But that led to reforms. And these reforms ended up increasing the scope of incarceration. And this is why there was a huge lag between doing the lawsuit or the exposé and then the closure of these spaces. And by lag, I mean, 15 to 30 years lag. And in my opinion, this is because the outcries led to more staff, more funding, more building. It didn't lead to less. And less is abolition. And I think that this is a really kind of big lesson. So one of the lessons that I want to convey to you is that deinstitutionalization, in my opinion, didn't happen en masse until it was abolitionary and non-reformist, until there was a change in social attitudes towards disability and towards mental health. And that change came from subjugated knowledges that I'll define in a second, of anti-psychiatry, consumer, survivors, ex-patient movements, parent movements as well, although there, the pendulum between reform and abolition was actually pretty interesting to follow and not always abolitionary at all. Parent movements were the ones that often wanted more funding, more staff, and so on, and not to abolish. And self-advocacy movements that really early on started to call for closing down all residential institutions for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, which they saw as a form of incarceration. And lastly, all of these advocate for reform, for abolition and not reform of institutions. So in this genealogy that I just gave you a very brief overview of, I want to now kind of bring it all together before I conclude. In this genealogy of deinstitutionalization as abolition, I want to say that deinstitutionalization was not always abolitionary, and it wasn't only abolitionary. But what I'm interested in is when was it and how was it abolitionary? And what made it move from reform, exposés, lawsuits, to saying no more, we shall not have any more institutions. Because I think that, now that we're talking about defund the police and prison abolition, I think that lesson is incredibly important. But I want to say, as a true Foucauldian genealogist, it's not replicable. So we can't actually take what I'm saying now and apply it to 2021 prison abolition. But I do want to say that this conceptualization of genealogy I do think it's incredibly useful. And by genealogy, I mean, I'm sure you all know this, so just very quickly, Foucault means two things. One is buried histories that he calls subjugated knowledges. And number two is knowledges that have been disqualified, things that were considered non-scientific or nonsensical. And this quote really stood out to me. I'm going to read it out loud. Foucault says, what he means by subjugated knowledge is the knowledge of the psychiatrist, the patient, the nurse, the doctor, that is parallel or marginal to medical knowledge, the knowledge of the delinquent, what I would call, if you like, what people know, which I do like. So this is from Foucault. And I marked here the words patient, nurse, and doctor, because I think that in deinstitutionalization, a lot of people that fought for the abolition of institutions were also doctors and nurses and people and staff and people that were in these institutions and knew these institutions. And I think that that's another, really important lesson. And this is not to at all take away from the knowledge of the psychiatrist, the patient, self-advocacy and all of that. But to say that, this is really just factually the history of deinstitutionalization, is that a lot of people that we consider to be people with power participated in it. One of the questions, and this is where the Crip or men of color critique comes in. One of the questions then that I ask in the book is, what happens when these kind of knowledges, the subjugated knowledges, the knowledges of the doctors that were discredited, but also the patients, the self-advocacy movements, the, so on, anti-psychiatry. What happens when these get absorbed? Which is a different question than about inclusion, right? Like, different questions than about exclusion. It's a question of what are the costs of being incorporated or included by what? Specific knowledges that were discredited. What happens when they become policy? What happens when they now become kind of a prescription? What occurs to abolitionary theorizing when it travels across fields and across time? And here particularly, I'm thinking about the notion of recovery, the normalization principle, notion of what decarceration means, notions of what inclusion means, which meant something completely different, like in the field of education, for example, for people that were called radical inclusionists in the 60s and 70s and onward. What happens when these concepts get taken up? What are the potential consequences when professionals or so-called experts, right, the doctor, the nurse, the staff, what happens when they push for population who were until now excluded because of institutionalization, incarceration, to get incorporated? What happens then? What is the price of inclusion, basically, is what I'm asking, as opposed to what is the price of exclusion, which I think is what most people are asking. And this is where, again, Crip or men of color critique, this is what it is. What is the price of inclusion? So this is what I'm calling this ink. By ink, I mean disability incarcerated and incorporated. So I'm using here the word incorporation to mean two things. One is the cultural and social incorporation of minority difference. This is from Rod Ferguson. Cultural and social incorporation of minority difference into the status quo. What happens when that happens? And the second thing that I mean by incorporation is literally like corporations, right? What happens when we talk about incorporation as a political, economic, profit-making agency? For example, what happens for things like recovery, when now we have literal corporations trying to sell psychiatrists people recovery? Literally, right? Like what happens when corporations hear alternatives to incarceration and then sell people, not just sell, make them buy electronic monitoring bracelets? So part of subjugated knowledges was that, right? Like knowledges that then was absorbed, was taken up, became policy, became actually a mandate. And then my question through Crip or men of color analysis is, what was the price of that? And I mean price tag, but also, culturally and otherwise. But secondly, what was part of subjugated knowledge was, of course, this maroon subjugated knowledges that some people call fugitive, These are knowledges that came from people who were psychiatrized, self-advocates, and so on. People who really understood and were affected, directly affected by capture, by state violence. Because to me, institutionalization is state violence. Through this fugitive knowledge, these activists rejected a call for gradual emancipation, and they called for the immediate end to oppression. And the reason why I'm calling it maroon knowledge is this is what was called in regards to slavery abolition, the abolition of enslavement in the United States. But this is all, prison abolitionists also bring that to the world of prison abolition today to talk about imprisoned intellectuals and people who are currently incarcerated and so on. And so what does it mean to rely on these kind of knowledges? And like I said earlier, self-advocacy, for example, very early on called for the abolition of institutions because those were people that exited institutions and they knew what that was like and they knew they don't want it. This is a quote from Avery Gordon, and it says, "Abolition time is a type of revolutionary time, but rather than stop the world, as in an absolute break between the now and then, it's actually a daily part of it." So people who are institutionalized, incarcerated, they cannot wait for the ideal conditions till something comes along that's better. The action that has to be taken is now. And this sense of urgency enables abolitionism to become a model for political activity. I'm kind of, these are my last points. I'm kind of concluding here that I want to bring it back to kind of Foucault's notion of subjugated knowledges and then, end. In response to critique that claimed that his work in Discipline and Punish was not practical, but only theoretical, Foucault explained that his role as an intellectual is not to prescribe solutions. He said, "It is true that certain people, such as those who work in the institutional setting of the prison, are not likely to find instructions in my book that tell them what is to be done. But my project is precisely to bring it about that they no longer know what to do, so that the acts, gestures, discourses that up until then had seemed to go without saying becomes problematic, difficult, dangerous." And he added, "It seems to me that what is to be done ought not to be determined from above by reformers, be they prophetic or legislative, but by a long work of comings and goings, of exchange, reflection, trials, and different analysis." And to me, that is the work of abolition. It's exactly that. It's critique. But again, I'm going back to this is why I'm concluding here, because remember in my first slide, I said this is one of the critiques put forth against abolition, is it's not prescriptive. It doesn't offer any solution. It only offers critiques. But I think if we understand critique in this way, I think it does offer a lot. And it particularly offers what I called in the book a disepistemology of abolition. So the goal of abolition is exactly this kind of coming and going, not knowing what to do. It's not finality, but it's process. So it's an ethic and an epistemology. It produces specific forms, not just content of knowledges. And one of the things that I suggest is that it's about letting go to particular attachment to knowledge. Remember, I talked about subjugated knowledges. Here, I'm talking about this epistemology of abolition that lets go of an attachment to certainty. What are the exact consequences of doing or not doing? Because again, we're in abolition time. We're in urgency. We're in capture. We're in state violence. This is not the time to wait. So you have to let go of notions of certainty. You have to also let go of the idea that anybody can have a definitive pathway to how to rid ourselves of carceral logic. And, again, this is partially what led to kind of this expert knowledge becoming policy. We will tell you how to recover. We will tell you how, to live your life outside of an institution. This is exactly what happened. To me, this is not abolition. I want to offer this epistemology of abolition instead, letting go of expertise, and so on. So this is my last slide, just to kind of conclude. A Crip of color critique of incarceration and abolition would be not just about people who identify as disabled people of color who are caught up in the system, but it's about understanding disability and abolition as also disability issues. From understanding disposability to premature death, to understanding the nature of systems of capture, to building a new world through knowing and unknowing, learning and unlearning. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Your challenge to ask imaginary person's questions makes me wish I brought my Foucault puppet to the session. But we have time for, yeah.
I think I'm gonna need to close the Zoom because it's stuck on the PowerPoint and come back.
Okay.
So
okay.
Let me see.
Are you still with us?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
But I'm gonna leave and come back just a sec.
Okay.
This is normally when we'd play the Jeopardy music. Dun, dun, dun. We're waiting. Yeah. Need some sound
Maybe
effects.
to save time, like if you have a question, if you could just put it in the chat. Then when she comes back, she can read them and answer a couple of them. So I don't want us to get too far behind and have to lose time elsewhere.
Sorry, technology.
Welcome back.
Should I answer the things in the chat?
Yeah, so since we had a little bit of downtime, in order to save time, I just asked folks to put their questions in the chat so that you could then come in and maybe pick a couple to answer, and then we'll move on and come back to things later, just to so we don't get too far behind.
I'm happy to also just you know, for the interest of time, just move and talk about everything later, if you want to do that. Okay, so I'll pick just one. Which is the first question that Corinne posed. A question about calling what I'm calling the price of inclusion and how whiteness circulates within the incorporation of disability. So that's a great point. So in the book, I talk about that a lot. One of the chapters is, for example, about the NIMBY phenomena, what we call in the social sciences NIMBY. NIMBY is not in my backyard. Not in my backyard, particularly in relation to the construction of group homes and halfway houses for people who exit institutions and prisons. And the NIMBY phenomena, as you can imagine, is incredibly about whiteness and about class. And I connect that more, that phenomena, to the history of racial segregation in housing in the US, and connect that to disability segregation in housing in the US. And I think the two are completely intertwined. I think this is a reaction from whiteness to be not in my backyard. Even though, of course, people with disabilities have always been a part, of the community, but denying something like group home or halfway house to be built, particularly on, suburban residential, areas, it's a phenomenon that's been discussed a lot in the social sciences. And it's just one example of how this works. But in that chapter, I also show how, unfortunately, it manifests itself also in disability movements, meaning that the way people fought against the NIMBY was to say, we are not like that. Like we are not illegal. We will not like dirty your neighborhood. We will not. So this kind of like proximity to whiteness or respectability politics was a way for people to counteract these kind of, what I think are, at least partially eugenicist kind of, thinking around pathologies, and so on and so on. So proximity to whiteness is part of disability inclusion, in my opinion.
Thank you so much.
Thank you again. Our next presenter is Corinne Lajoie. Corinne is a philosopher working in the fields of phenomenology, philosophy of disability, feminist philosophy, and ethics. Currently, their research focuses on questions of access, belonging, and disorientation. Their work has been published in the Journal of the American Philosophical Association, Hypatia, Chiasme, and Symposium. Corinne's paper is Crip, Disorientations, and the Complexity of Belonging. Corinne, you have the Zoom floor.
Thank you so much. All right, I will start with the technical stuff and then introduce myself. Is everyone seeing my slides correctly? Yeah, thank you. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. And I was so grateful and excited to be invited to be on this panel with Liat and Nirmala. And it's a great honor to be part of the inaugural panel. So my talk today is titled Crip, Disorientations, and the Complexity of Belonging. I will be reading from my paper, and just in terms of access, I think that my slides and talk should be accessible somehow, Joel.
Yes, they are. I just dropped the link to be able to download those and follow along on people's own computer. I dropped that link in the chat box.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm just gonna move this. All right. So my talk is titled Crip, Disorientations, and the Complexity of Belonging. Oops. There we go. All right, so I'm showing a slide now with an image, a photo of a person seated in a wheelchair and hanging upside down from a ceiling against a bright blue background. The person's arms are spread out over their heads and they seem to be soaring. So part one, prologue. In an essay titled The Beauty of Spaces Created for and by Disabled People, S.E. Smith describes their experience of attending a dance performance in a space created for and by disabled people. The dancers and choreographers, Alice Shepard and Laura Lawson, quote, roll out on the stage and begin weaving intricate patterns with their bodies and wheelchairs, end of quote. While music, light, and an audio description of their movements, quote, soar over them, end of quote. In the audience, Smith writes, quote, canes dangle from back seats and a gilded prosthetic leg gleams under the safety lights, end of quote. Sitting in a row below Smith, quote, a blind woman turns a tiny model of the stage over in her hands. tracing her fingers along with it in time to the audio description, end of quote. Smith recalls feeling spellbound and overwhelmed. They conclude, "It is very rare as a disabled person that I have an intense sense of belonging, of being not just tolerated or included in a space, but of actively owning it. This space, I whisper to myself, is for me," end of quote. After the performance, the dancers roll to the front of the stage for a Q&A session. Smith observes that, quote, "The audience is momentarily frozen," end of quote. Disabled people are, quote, "still processing what just happened, feeling slightly giddy," end of quote, at the realization that parts of themselves that they normally keep buttoned up and hidden away took center stage in the performance. A non-disabled person hesitantly breaks the ice. They observe that they liked seeing the ramp on set. This time, Smith writes, non-disabled audience members are, quote, "on the other side of the access divide," end of quote. It is not so much that they are unwelcomed in the theater. However, quote, "the space has not been tailored to their needs and designed to seamlessly accommodate them," end of quote. This time, they are the ones to stand out. Smith wonders, and I wonder with them, how did it feel for non-disabled people, quote, "to see disabled people spreading their wings and soaring," end of quote. How did it feel to experience the possibility of a space created by and for disabled people? At the end of the night, after the Q&A session, audience members gather their belongings and regretfully disperse back out into the able-bodied world, quote, "beyond Crip space," end of quote. Immediately, quote, "barriers begin to reappear," end of quote. Passerby gawk, stare, and point fingers, quote, "mysterious sticky substances cling to wheels and canes," end of quote. The cold and humidity perhaps awaken pains and aches that had temporarily quieted down in the warm theater. Bright lights, loud noises, and unexpected smells overwhelm the senses. Finally, at the nearest subway station, the elevators are, as usual, out of order. A reminder that outside the walls of the theater, disability is an afterthought. Part 2, what are we in for? And on this slide, I have a photo of a shiny new metallic ramp outside an unidentifiable building, and the ramp is installed on a brick floor. I begin this paper with Smith's beautifully crafted narrative because it is indicative of the many complexities of thinking about the phenomenology of access and belonging from a disability perspective. To begin, Smith refuses the easy and all too frequent conflation of access with the rhetoric of inclusion. In the current Post-Americans with Disabilities Act era in the United States, access is most often collapsed with the minimal provision of mandated accommodations. When taken in the most general sense, accommodations are popularly imagined as incommensurate with exclusion. Thus, new ramps are hurriedly affixed to the main entrance of a centennial building. Course syllabi include a mandatory section on disability service offerings, and an official document's technical jargon is synthesized in a reader-friendly list. The building, the course, and the document are inclusive because they are accessible, and they are accessible because they check all the required boxes. Disability scholars have shown that this view of access is problematically limited. To put it bluntly, accommodations in themselves do nothing to transform the ableist organization of social existence. They do not transform or even begin to interrogate how highly racialized, gendered, classed, and sexualized hierarchies of somatic and cognitive capacity produce vastly different experiences of disability and differentially restrict access to resources, employment, education, activism, care, and community. Compliance-based, highly bureaucratized approaches to disability inclusion also have dangerously depoliticizing effects. Within this framework, the liberation of disabled people is transformed into a logistical problem requiring logistical solutions. But also, as disability activist Leah Lakshmi Piepshna Samarasina reminds us, quote, access is just the first step on the way to a liberated disabled future. It's not the whole of it, not by a long shot, end of quote. Tanya Tichkovsky raises a similar point when she writes that fighting for access is, quote, only half the battle, end of quote. The second, perhaps most difficult half of the equation is to, quote, think about or question what we have indeed been given access to and what we are in for, end of quote. Liberated disabled futures will be accessible, but we must also critically interrogate the sense or meaning of accessible worlds. Put another way, the what of what we are in for matters as much as the fact that we are in for it. To begin understanding what we are in for when we create accessible worlds, I turn to phenomenology and ask how access and lack of access are experienced. I connect this analysis to a critical reflection on the worldly disorientations that open and foreclose our possibilities for being in the world with others. From a phenomenological perspective, accommodationist approaches to access tell us nothing about how ableist social worlds are experienced by disabled people. It is very possible, after all, that even after every box has been ticked on the accessibility checklist, disabled people will not feel like they belong in a particular space. Belonging, as Smith's essay reminds us, is something different than the assurance that one will be tolerated or included in a particular space. What Smith describes experiencing in Crip space is, quote, an intense feeling, an intense sense of belonging, end of quote. This intense sense of belonging, I propose, comes from relaxing into a space that anticipates and desires one's existence. Planning defensively for the eventuality that disabled people will show up produces a radically different set of experiences than do efforts to creatively configure the necessary scaffoldings to support disabled movement, action, thought, and existence. Thinking about access phenomenologically also brings forth a series of questions about what it means to exist in a world made for some, but not others. My theorization of access proceeds from these questions. In making access into a question, I reject its common theorization as a legal solution to the problem posed by the presence of disabled people. Of course, thinking about access through the lens of legal compliance is how access is most frequently and ordinarily discussed. This tells us something about how and which things recede to the background and become ordinary. In contradistinction with legalistic conceptions of access, I theorize access as an embodied, socially embedded, relational practice that arises through the dynamic encounter between disabled and non-disabled body minds and the spaces that they inhabit and co-produce. Access is emergent rather than fixed, and it is collective rather than individual. Lastly, as much as it centrally includes and requires changes made to the concrete material infrastructures of our shared life worlds, it cannot be reduced to the presence of a ramp. I propose that we turn to the lived and felt sense of belonging in all its affective and existential complexity to understand what access means and what kinds of worlds we are given access to when we get in. Part 3, complex belonging or the treacherous landscape. I'm showing an image of a photo of a narrow, treacherous, I can't say that word, path on the edge of a steep mountain. Tall trees are growing on the flank of the mountain, and parts of the mountain are covered with green moss. Smith's essay advances the idea that the experience of finding Crip community can be both transformative and disorienting. Shepard and Lawson's performance feels, quote, weighty and sacred, end of quote, because it affirms the value of disability against a world that views disability merely as lack or tragedy. In this room, for one night, disability is not an afterthought. The sense of belonging that Smith experiences in Crip's space is marked by, quote, the deep rightness that comes from not having to explain or justify their existence, end of quote. Crip space, for Smith, is energizing. It provides a necessary, quote, resting point, end of quote, that temporarily interrupts the exhaustion of constantly mobilizing for basic access in everyday life. What Anika Conrad calls access fatigue denotes the slow wearing down, the physical and affective wearing out that makes it difficult to go on in ableist life worlds. Although access is not the end goal or a fixed state of affairs, it can provide a time and space for disabled people to exist outside this constant wearing down and wearing out. Crip space can also offer a respite from the relentless pace and pressures of ableism. This pace and pressure create what Sarah Ahmed calls stress points, quote, points of social and physical pressure that can be experienced as a physical press on the surface of the skin, end of quote. Ahmed offers the example of how non-white bodies, quote, bodies that do not follow the line of whiteness, end of quote, are stopped in their tracks. Non-white bodies may be stopped when they enter a room that feels like a sea of whiteness, or when their movements are policed by racist stop and frisk mandates. Being stopped in one's tracks does not merely interrupt the course of action, it can also disrupt it. Being stopped reveals to us that, quote, the ground into which we sink our feet is not neutral. It gives ground to some more than others, end of quote. Some are given ground, others lose their ground or find no ground to begin with. Crip space can give ground to disabled people by functioning as a resting point. At the same time, however, Smith's essay reminds us of the difficulty of creating worlds where disabled people can belong with our entire selves. In fact, Smith seems acutely aware of the challenges of reimagining the shape of belonging. Their essay retains the affective and existential complexity of belonging, its coextensiveness with the risks of building community. Finding Crip community can be intimidating or frightening, not least because it positions one as out of line with the able-bodied world. Developing a sense of belonging in Crip space might require us to let go of lifelines that connect us to the able-bodied world. It might position us as slantwise in relation to worlds of sense to which others belong. Smith writes, and that's the quote on the slide, quote, we need the sense of community for disabled people created in Crip space. Yet like any ground, it comes with soft spots and pitfalls. a reminder that the landscape is not uniform, can even become treacherous, end of quote. In reading Smith's essay, I am left with this image of belonging as a treacherous landscape, neither smooth nor universal, uniform, or exclusively oriented. This image of belonging as a treacherous landscape, equally thrilling and unpredictable, brings forth a more nuanced understanding of this notion than currently exists in the phenomenological literature. Phenomenologically, we might begin to describe belonging through the originary entwinement between body and world. The phenomenological notion of being in the world designates a relationship of intimacy between the feeling body and its environment, and one in which neither term supersedes the other. In adapting this Heideggerian notion, Maurice Merleau-Ponty famously translates it to the French être au monde, at once being situated in the world from the start and orienting oneself in it or against its ground, but also being of it in the sense of belonging with it. At an ontological level, then, belonging designates a mutual entanglement. It indexes the impossibility of separating body and world entirely from each other. At a practical level, belonging indexes the complicity between body and world in everyday action, or the ways in which, as Sarah Ahmed writes, quote, spaces become a second skin that unfolds in the folds of the body, end of quote. On this view, the intentional structure of belonging is anticipatory. One enters a room expecting that it will be, and here I'm quoting from Smith, tailored to their needs and designed to seamlessly accommodate them, end of quote. When one's body seamlessly fits into the room, these needs stop being perceivable as needs that one can have. They recede into the background, along with the realization that, quote, space is made to anticipate some bodies by making some bodies anticipate their own fit. And that's from Tanya Tichkovsky. The more you fit in, the more you belong. This story about belonging offers us important insights about embodied existence. It does not, however, capture the lived experience of disabled being in the world. In thinking about belonging primarily through the lens of complicity, it is difficult to account for the treacherous landscape that Smith describes, with its unavoidable soft spots and pitfalls. The story we tell about belonging must be more complex. I submit that belonging is not, in fact, best described through the lens of a seamlessly integrated, unfailing, and optimally bound body-world relation. For one, belonging is not something that is achieved once and for all and secured against the possibility of change. Consider, for instance, Smith's retelling of their evening. When they step outside the warm and dimly lit space of the theater with other disabled audience members, they fall back into the able-bodied world with its stairs, sticky pavements, and out-of-order elevators. Their body minds register this difference. The temporary respite offered by Crip space is interrupted by the all too familiar experience of feeling out of place. Bodily existence is realized at the heart of reversible, temporally open-ended body-world relations. In other words, our body's orientation in the world is labile and dynamic. In some cases, our bodies achieve an equilibrium with their surroundings. What Maurice Merleau-Ponty calls a pact is realized, which allows us to dwell in a particular place without fearing that the ground under our feet will suddenly give way. This equilibrium, however, adheres strictly neither to our bodies nor to the world. Rather, our sense of being oriented arises through the experience of a meaningful encounter between body and world. In other cases, the equilibrium between our body and the world is threatened or lost. Spatial environments can just as well offer a ground for the exercise of our freedom and agency as they can feel uncooperative, throw us off course, restrain and isolate us, or make us feel adrift, alienated, and out of place. When body and world line up seamlessly, belonging may feel as though it is secured once and for all. When body and world do not sync up, however, a queer sense of uncanniness might surface. Certain objects or feelings might come up, or we might come up against them in the process of falling out of line temporally, spatially, or effectively, out of sync, out of joint. Furthermore, the privilege of an indistinguishable fit with the world in oppressive social contexts is not universal. In her work on the notion of home, Mariana Ortega explains that the security and comfort commonly associated with belonging frequently go hand in hand with, quote, the expulsion of those who do not fit a version of authentic belonging, end of quote. This ideal of authentic belonging might involve taking up whiteness as an orientation, such that authentic belonging becomes, quote, the barred room of whiteness, end of quote, that feminists of color have warned us about. Citing Ahmed now, whiteness orientates bodies in specific directions, affecting how they take up space, end of quote, what spaces they take up, and where they belong or not. By naturalizing whiteness as a worldly orientation, authentic belonging relies on the exclusion of non-white people from structures of care, community, and solidarity. Feminists of color have shown that dominant conceptions of belonging can and often do function to exclude those whose experiences fall outside the scope of dominant somatic, cognitive, and affective norms. On this view, striving for an indistinguishable fit with the world in the context of non-ideal, oppressive social relations is neither ethically nor existentially desirable. Instead, our understanding of belonging must factor how relations of power and exploitation affect the organization of shared life worlds, as well as embodied structures of belonging within them. Building on these insights, my suggestion is not that we should strive to develop a robust sense of belonging that is continuous with racist, classist, heterosexist, and ableist life worlds. As Ahmed explains it, quote, orientation devices direct the flow of human traffic, end of quote, in ways that are continuous with the status quo. When the status quo is the reproduction of violence, we must insist on being out of line, even if being out of line is read as stubbornness, willfulness, or obstinacy. A minimal description of Crip belonging might be this: a collective insistence on staying disoriented and disorienting a world that does not desire our existence. Moving on to the last part of my presentation, disorientation as method for Crip phenomenology. And I have here a photo of a wooden hammer with a red metal head. So the head is severed from the handle or from the grip, making it impossible to grip. The parts are lying side by side against a gray background. Starting with moments when bodies and worlds do not sync up positions disorientations as central to my account of belonging. The Crip notion of belonging that I have in mind neither precludes the possibility of disorientations nor devalues them. I do not think that belonging must be yoked to the sense of being explosively oriented in the world. To borrow a formulation by Amy Hamray, quote, For those of us whose bodies do not follow smooth, predictable temporalities, whose ways of being and moving find friction within our social and built environments, end of quote, disorientations might be a central part of how we move through and dwell in the world. More generally, disorientations cannot be entirely avoided, and many can be beneficial. All of us will encounter some type of disorientation at least once in our lives, albeit with different levels of exposure and available support to navigate them. I mentioned earlier that gaining access to access can be disorienting. Smith's experience of Crip space, for example, was disorienting. The beauty of disabled bodies coming together and crafting modes of being and expression that defied the limitations of the normate world spurred a rich sense of disorientation. So too does the everydayness of inaccessibility generate disorientations for disabled people, but they are disorientations of a different kind. The experience of finding oneself constantly out of place in one's environment throws the world up or throws the body from its ground in ways that make it difficult to belong in the world. Some disorientations can allow us to revise unexamined beliefs about the value of dependency and solidarity, or the undesirability of illness and disability. Others are structurally enforced through systems of domination that discriminate between valuable and disposable forms of existence. The task of distinguishing between different types of disorientation is an essential part of a Crip phenomenology of access. It requires that we ask questions about how disorientations are distributed, which ones are intrinsically harmful or debilitating, and how those harms can be reduced or better addressed. Thus, disorientations are an important phenomenological object of study. But I also view disorientations as a methodological starting point for Crip phenomenology. Joel Michael Reynolds describes Crip phenomenology as an approach that, quote, takes experiences of disability as its point of departure, end of quote. Reynolds turns to Merleau-Ponty's famous analysis of the blind man's cane in Phenomenology of Perception to show that Merleau-Ponty, quote, misconstrues the radicality of blindness as a world-creating disability, by, end of quote, by reinstating non-disability as the ground from which disability is studied. A Crip method, in contrast, quote, exposes the able-bodied assumptions of a given conceptual terrain or methodology, and second, articulates a conceptual reconstruction of that terrain grounded in non-normate experience, end of quote. Cripping phenomenology asks that we start with the difference disability makes. Disability makes a difference for our understanding of bodily existence and worldly belonging, but it also makes a difference for phenomenology itself. The difference that disability makes disorients the terrain on which phenomenological study grounds itself in at least two ways. First, exploring the ableist assumptions embedded in phenomenology disorients the sense of phenomenology and urges us to consider its tools anew. Thomas Abrams begins his short musing called Disability at the Limits of Phenomenology with a provocation. He writes, "Disability is a problem for phenomenology," end of quote. Abrams' point is not, of course, that disability is inherently problematic. Rather, his claim is that we must ask ourselves if phenomenology's tools can be employed to account for and, quote, affirm the lives of disabled people, end of quote, beyond a mere intellectual interest in pathological forms of embodiment. If they are to be relevant for the study of disability, Abrams argues that phenomenology's tools must be reoriented. I would amend Abrams' claim to add that they must first be disoriented. They must lose their ground before being reoriented. Disability disorients phenomenology in a second way. The conceptual reconstruction described by Reynolds asks that we begin with, quote, the irreducible multiplicity of worlds created through the constitutive phylogenetic polymorphism and ontogenetic variability of human corporeality, end of quote. These irreducibly multiple worlds are neither smooth nor universal, uniform, or exclusively oriented. They are shaped by and through the experience of disability, bursting at the seams with its irreducibly multiple ways of seeing, speaking, stuttering, strolling, signing, drooling, dreaming, and surviving. Grounding phenomenology in these non-normate modes of existence fundamentally alters both the kinds of descriptions we produce and our conception of possible worlds. In this process, we can begin to reimagine the shape of belonging. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Corinne. We have approximately 10 minutes for questions, so you can go ahead and raise your Zoom hand or drop your questions in the chat. Joel? Or oh wait, that's not Joel. It's the boxes are moving around. I think it's Kim.
Those boxes. Anyway, thank you for that presentation. So a question, and I'm thinking about the question of belonging in Crip context, and thinking with Mariana Ortega's work and also Maria Lugones' work and Alison Kafer. So sort of thinking about these folks where I wonder if, like, I understand and the question of disorientation and the importance of losing ground. My question is, what about that process of reorientation? Because it would seem that for Crip, disability is in question and is a question, that there is a sort of thinking on and against also what disability itself is, or how it includes or excludes, right? Certain modes of navigating the world, certain embodiments, right? Certain body mind ways of being. So I'm wondering about that sense of the space as respite and the process of reorientation, as opposed to that space as critical, right? Where there is that kind of political commitment to rethinking the ground that kind of also understands that it's sort of provisional ground, that it's a ground of solidarity, right? But not a ground that sort of is there once one turns, if I think about Ahmed, right, turning from one direction, right, to another. I don't know, I'm thinking out loud with you, but I wonder if that's something that is consistent with what you're thinking about as a Crip method for phenomenology.
Thank you. Can I ask you a question about your question, just to be sure? So I just want to answer in a relevant way. So is the question about how, because you mentioned the notion of ground as a kind of resting, or the ground as a resting point, and then you also mentioned this notion of the ground as solidarity. So is the question about the relationship between the two, or whether they might not be compatible, maybe, or am I not?
Oh yeah, no, the question is I was thinking about that because you talked about the disorientation as losing ground, which I thought was really well put. But I'm wondering about the relationship between disorientation and reorientation in a Crip context, where the ground, it seems to me, remains in question, right? What is this? What is, when I think of the ground, also I think with this sense of belonging and commonality, where there is a great deal of multiplicity. So how do we sort of think about that relationship between disorientation and reorientation as you're thinking about it?
Yeah, thank you. Those questions are really helpful, especially because it kind of just occurred to me as I was reworking this presentation that I emphasized it, but that I kept coming back to this image of the ground, and that I'm not exactly sure where I want to take it. So your questions are helpful in terms of seeing how it's understood. I like this idea. I find it interesting that, so two things, I guess. On the one hand, I'm interested in the more kind of concrete and practical aspects of what it means to kind of build community and build coalition across these kinds of differences. And there's definitely Lugones's notion of complex communication in particular is really kind of influential for how I'm trying to flesh out this notion of complex belonging, because I think that within phenomenology, the notion of belonging has been described in oftentimes overly simplistic ways and ways that don't pay attention to relations of power and to the ways in which like belonging is always going to be very messy, especially when it involves working across different subject positions. So that's kind of one aspect of it that I'm seeing, kind of calling into question the idea, and also calling into question this, these very romanticized conceptions of community that are based on recognition, based on commonality, and ultimately based on kind of invisibilized forms of exclusion is one thing that I'm very concerned about. And then maybe at a more kind of epistemological level in terms of, Crip theory, kind of calling into question the disability as the ground for, the work that we do, and also disability as a kind of, legible and fixed identity category. That's definitely not something that I had thought about much, but that I would like to consider. And then just briefly, regarding the notion of reorientation is also something that I'm not exactly sure what I want to say about. Again, concretely, I don't, I think that I'm wary of the kind of primacy of orientation everywhere, and especially within phenomenology. But at the same time, I also think that sometimes being disoriented can be untenable and can be really draining and really difficult. And so that's also something that I'm thinking about. But I'm just noticing a lot of focus on becoming reoriented, and the idea of reorientation or orientation being connected with ideas of certainty, of fixity, and I'm just kind of trying to take a step back from that. So I hope that I addressed different aspects, but would love to talk about these things more.
Thank you. Thank you.
Joel?
Thanks so much for that fantastic talk. This panel is already amazing, and it's not even over yet. Can everyone hear me okay first? My question is, on the one hand, it's about conceptual clarity that I have always felt is lacking in my own head. And on the other hand, it's probably a question about literatures and how they interact, and namely the space between Crip theory as it's used in queer theory spaces primarily, and then the way that in your work, in Kim Hall's work, to some extent in my work, the use of the term Crip in these more narrow phenomenology spaces. And I'm just curious if you think, is it your sense that this term is doing really distinct work theoretically and also relative to the sorts of debates that these two spaces are engaged in? Do you think that it's more or less homologous, the terms kind of doing the same thing, but just in different spaces? Is it neither of those things? I'm very curious to hear you say more about that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And especially now that it's being brought up twice, probably something that I should think about more in the way that I'm using it. Perhaps it's true that I am using it in a narrower narrower sense. I'm definitely using the term to kind of signal affinities with queer theory, and especially, you know, I see a lot of kind of, you know, I draw a lot on Ahmed for my work, and I see a lot of like the way in which Ahmed develops the notion of disorientation to be, you know, I mean, she's not making an argument about disability, but I find a lot of kind of relevance in that work for how I think about disability. I also, you know, appreciate the fact that talking about Crip disorientations allows me to, you know, kind of in a sense, suspend a commitment to this kind of objective of defining what counts as disability once and for all, and being able to kind of signal affinities with different kind of non-normative, you know, experiences of embodiment. And that's some work that I kind of want it to do. I also use, you know, the notion of, in kind of the longer project that this is associated with, I want to kind of talk about questions of method as well, and the ways in which using disorientation as a method also means kind of queering our conception of what method is and what method can allow us to do. So there's all of these kinds of, I think for now, there may be more kind of, yeah, like little points, nodes of connection, but I don't think that I have like a very clear answer to how I'm using Crip. And so that's definitely something that I'd like to think about, especially because I do want to kind of, you know, use the notion of Crip phenomenology and think about specifically what it would mean to kind of disorient phenomenology, and to kind of, you know, use its tools against it sometimes to talk about disability, which is what I think needs to be done. So yeah, I'm really hoping to develop a more kind of a whole chapter. Actually, I'll have to think through all of these questions.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Corinne, and everybody for your questions. Just so you don't miss it, Corinne, there's a question from Liat in the chat about, well, not a question, but I guess a suggestion for following up later on about synergies in your work. Just for the sake of time, we will move on to our third and final presentation for our panel today. Our next speaker is Nirmala Erevelles. She is a professor of social and cultural studies in education at the University of Alabama. Her teaching and research interests lie in the areas of disability studies, critical race theory, transnational feminism, sociology of education, and post-colonial studies. She will be presenting the paper Crippin Empire, Decolonization at the Intersections. Thank you so much for joining us. You have the floor.
Unmute. I hope I can be heard, and I have my PowerPoint. And as you can see, the title of my presentation is a little different because I think I'm still talking about the same arguments, except that I'm really thinking about empires, others, and I'm trying to play on this notion of othering as it occurs in the context of empire. Before I go on to talk about my paper, I just wanted to say also thank you for this opportunity. I feel honored to be in this space, a little nervous because I am not a philosopher, and I was grateful that I was the third person because I think I could hang on the coattails of my two other brilliant presenters. And yeah, and I really appreciate you. I hope you all will be able to see even though we may not have necessarily talked to each other and we are coming from very different angles, I hope you'll be able to see also the connections in all our work. And I really appreciate the kinds of arguments the two of you who went ahead of me were making. My PowerPoint, I always tell people that my PowerPoint is usually more a distraction from having me read a paper and you staring at somebody reading the paper. A lot of the description on my PowerPoint is actually in the narrative that's there, and there may be a couple of times where I may stop and just point to a couple of things, but it's really more I call it the background noise. So yeah, and I apologize if that can be disorienting for some of you too. Okay. So I'm going to read my paper with maybe a few things interrupting it, only because it will just help me get the flow and will keep me in the time that's necessary. Okay. Okay, this is not moving. My thing is not moving now. Okay, here it is. Yeah, thank you. Okay. I'm starting with a quote by Teju Cole called in an article called Unmountable Bodies. We may not be able to attend to each outrage in every corner of the world, but we should at least pause to consider how it is that mainstream opinion so quickly decides that certain violent deaths are more meaningful and more worthy of commemoration than others, unquote. And I'm just using, this was actually written in the context of the massacre for the Boko Haram in Nigeria. And there's a picture of candles on one side, and then this kind of cartoon description that where it says, "Mommy, why isn't the world standing up for us?" And they have a group of people of a picture of women in hijab and people responding to it. Okay. In this paper, and I was just going to say, in this paper, what I'm really trying to do, I'm going to be reading three scenes, but I'm going to be talking about how disability as a critical analytic refuses erasure despite the violent actions of empire against its colonized non-citizens. Okay. Yeah, which is, okay, sorry, that's my project. Scene 1, Flint, Michigan. The first time I had ever heard of Flint, Michigan was watching Michael Moore's documentary, Roger and Me. At that time, witnessing how General Motors had leached almost all the life from that city, taking away employment and its hope, and leaving behind the rusty detritus of closed factories and degraded natural resources, I could not imagine anything worse happening to this already desolate city. And then the news broke out that the water in Flint, Michigan contained lead, so beyond even the limits of dangerous, the water the shade of a dirty gold, giving even the double layers of plastic that encased it a poisonous hue. Though the news broke out in January 2016, this horrible, dangerous crisis was long in becoming what it now is. Beginning as early as April 24th, 2014, when the city of Flint decided to save money by opting to use water from the Flint River, a river already polluted by GM several years earlier, rather than from the Detroit city water system. Almost immediately, residents complained of its taste and its odor, witnessed their bodies erupt in boils and rashes, seemingly in protest against the toxic bacteria found there, and demanded action, only to be told that they needed to boil this water several times and to calm down. There was no palpable threat. It is this threat of what exists in this water supply that is critical to our questions about disability and race and class. Whose bodies were presumed to be immune to this threat? Remember that this threat began almost at the same time as the global terror over the Ebola virus was spreading in a few countries in West Africa. What does this mean that the Center of Disease Control and the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Homeland Security were not desperate to destroy, isolate, quarantine this vector of disease and eradicate its deadly spread through its most desolate citizenry? And I think those questions prevail even right now in this pandemic. Is this because in this case, the pathologies of destruction lie not in bodies, but in the political and economic histories contaminating the very infrastructures that are central to the nourishment of our bodies and our lives? How does this realization decompose the very notion of citizenship, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and its corresponding responsibilities in the context of such egregious acts of environmental injustice and its potent threat to the citizenry in the so-called first world country in the global north? More importantly, what exactly is this threat, and what does this do to the possibility of imagining critical coalitions around disability and its associate categories of difference? We know that even the smallest presence of lead in the bloodstream can cause impairments, both physical and cognitive. What does this recognition signify to our burgeoning radical community, disability community? How does disability pride jostle for recognition in the hostile ableist context where disability is commonly thought of as social death? And what will this proliferation of disabled bodies do to the disability movement when these bodies located at the intersections of race, class, disability, queer identities belong nowhere and are claimed by no one? Perhaps because a callous political economy seems to overwhelm the sense of cultural collectivity when disability makes itself known in each of these diverse groups. Remember, minority groups have had to claim that they are not disabled in order to be recognized by white bourgeois society. The fact, though, that ableism constructs disability as social death is concretely materialized via the effects of lead poisoning that brings impairments found in children of color living in low-income neighborhoods. And actually, the picture I have there is actually of a stairway in a public school in Detroit. So I'm talking about, and the title is Detroit Public Schools, the Post-Colonial Ghetto. La Paperson has called these spaces of desolation the post-colonial ghetto, an urban space of dislocation. In another characterization, In another characterization, Richard Sennett has described the sequestering of unwanted racialized and class bodies as, and I quote, an urban condom, protecting urban residents from the polluting intercourse of its outcasts. Note again, these representations focus on who is pathologized in these representations, as well as what conditions, spaces, and events produce such pathologization. Because lead poisoning can create both cognitive and behavioral impairments, many of these children are consigned to the segregated, under-resourced, punitive educational context of special education that eventually become, for several of these children, a fast track along the school to prison pipeline. And I have several statistics here, and actually I'm not going to read them because there's really may not be that much time, but it's to really talk about in Chicago, in the Chicago city schools, the rates of children of color being overrepresented in the school in the school to prison pipeline is actually pretty bad. And so there's like 86% of arrests happened in school buildings, and 84% of these arrests were for misdemeanor offenses. Scene 2. Okay, oh, sorry. Valerie Polakov, no, not yet scene 2. Valerie Polakov described these conditions as social toxicity. Put simply then, and she points out that these conditions lead to what she calls a socially toxic environment in the educational lives of children. Here, social toxicity is a term used to describe the degree to which the social world has become poisonous to a person's social well-being. And so you can see, even though she doesn't talk about disability, she's really invoking in some ways a social model of disability, but here in a very racialized and class context. Put simply then, it is the social toxicity that needs to be pathologized, not the children whose lives are framed by so much suffering and structural violence. Scene 2, Ferguson, Missouri, and these were scenes from protests during the Black Lives Matter movement at Ferguson. In the hot afternoon August sun, a brown body lay face down on the bloodied blacktop surface. partially covered by a sheet for 4 long emotional hours. The lax yellow police tape separating the slowly gathering crowd on the grassy roadside from the desolate body devastated by several shots fired by a police officer seemed ineffectual to contain the soon-to-be outrage that would spark a movement, Black Lives Matter, a movement that will also propel a little-known small Missouri town into national and international prominence. By nightfall, the unearthly silences that mark the scene of murder would be replaced by the whine of bullets, the crackle of tear gas, the sirens, the shattering of glass, and the screams of pain amidst fire and smoke and blood and a mounting desperate rage. The state police, intent on protecting private property, belligerently faced off against a mass of brown, black, and white bodies with hands raised up to say, "Don't shoot." But it must not matter because the police shootings continued unabated as more bodies fall, almost all of them brown and black, many of them queer, trans, and disabled. And I have a picture of names, like you may not be able to read them completely, but they're names of people. And I just wanted you to get a sense of the immense number of bodies that have, actually people that have died at the hands of police. And there's one poster that says "Justice for Mario Woods," but then there's several other pictures, photographs of a lot of people who were killed. This incomplete roll call of unarmed, murdered, Black, brown, disabled, and trans bodies has inspired another hashtag slogan in the face of this epidemic of so much violence. I can't breathe. I use the term epidemic tentatively, which describes the rapid spread of an infectious disease to a large number of people in a context where the disease is not normally prevalent. An epidemic does not necessarily have to be contagious, only prolific in its destruction of human relations and the disruption of social life. On the other hand, the term endemic refers to disease that is chronically prevalent in a specific context and region, and is sometimes assumed to be native and natural to the region. And I read these two definitions that appeared on the screen. Following this logic, while an epidemic can be halted in its tracks towards concerted efforts to eradicate it, a disease that is endemic is assumed to be stubbornly resistant to any and all interventions. So is the violence directed against Black, brown, and disabled bodies a recent epidemic? Or are such murders endemic to US society, given its brutal history of settler colonialism, slavery, imperialism, and transnational capitalism? What are the implications of reading these murders through these two radically different lenses? How does the deployment of a medical model to address an epidemic of violence shape the way we read the social? Where does the locus of the pathological lie? In the bodies of the fallen citizens or in the police who serve the militarized state? Will our efforts at transformation appear inadequate, given that the roots of endemic violence arise from a violent pathology that is assumed to be natural to US society? Also, what kinds of interventions does a medical model inspire when violence is viewed as a disease that needs to be urgently eradicated? And will that foreclose alternative interventions that could foreground an ethics of caring for others in our simultaneously well-connected and yet hopelessly divided worlds? Unfortunately, this epidemic of violence has not been limited to our national borders, but is also evident on a transnational scale. And these are just headlines from all over the world on what I'm talking about right now, and I'm calling it the pandemics of violence. The vast majority of the victims of these transnational epidemics continue to be brown, Black, disabled bodies, and prompts the question about whether these deaths should be understood within the context of a pandemic that raises the stakes because its infectious disease effects, here violence, have now spread to human populations, and I quote from Wikipedia, across a large region, for instance, multiple continents and even worldwide. What kind of response does a pandemic require as per a medical model? Or is such pandemic violence endemic to the human condition, where it is argued that there will always be some bodies that will be naturally cast as victims of some other body's violence, and hence requires no intervention, because how can one interrupt the always shifting, transitory, and random hands of fate? Scene 3. I got it 5, but sorry, it's scene 3. Garment sweatshop in Bangladesh. And again, these are just pictures of newspaper reports on this sweatshop. Jaspreet Puar, in her 2 essays, Prognosis Time and Coda, proposes the category of debility, and actually in a new book too, proposes the category of debility as an alternative to disability because it refuses a reliance on identity politics and embraces instead the affective turn towards change, evolution, transformation, and movement. She calls this a different kind of resistance. Debility, according to Puar, foregrounds the precarious nature of both capacity and debility, where bodies located in neoliberal regimes are subject to surveillance technologies and related bioinformatic economies, example, DNA encoding, stem cell research, and biometrics, and are assessed based on shifting indices of health, illness, disability, debility, infirmity, fertility, environmental safety, and climate change. This was a quote. Here, debility is conceived not as non-productive excess, but as emergent forms of new information, another quote, efficiently harnessed by capitalism for profits. An example, health insurance, fitness mandates, gay tourism, gay marriage. In this sleight of hand, debility is not mired in discourses of lack, but is transformed into a temporal construct that is, and I quote, always debilitated in relation to its ever-expanding potentiality, unquote. Moreover, since there is no body that meets the standard of the adequately able-bodied anymore, because you're never young enough or healthy enough or happy enough, all bodies are subject to, and I quote, gradations of capacity and debility in controlled societies, a move that serves to blur the distinction between disabled and non-disabled in solely pathological terms. I argue here that though the temporal categories of debility, capacity, and capacity that render bourgeois futures precarious via neoliberal biopolitics are very different from the historical category of disability that brands subjects as disposable exploited labor, dislocated from the land and its resources, that many of them produce actually in the first place, in the interest of transnational capitalism. Disabled subjectivities are often constituted at the very heart of the relations of production and exchange that enable neoliberal biopolitics to exist in the first place. Here, disability is not a metaphor for oppressive subjectivities, but a material subject produced in the heart of oppressive social relations of class antagonisms, as this last narrative describes. Here is the BBC report of one of the 4 survivors interviewed a year after the collapse of the garment factory Rana Plaza in Bangladesh. Mosamat Rebecca Khatun was stuck under the rubble for 2 days after the Rana Plaza collapsed. She lost a foot and a leg. She also lost 5 family members, including her mother. On the day of the incident, my mother came up to me and said, "Rebecca, you haven't had breakfast. Let us eat something before we start working." She went to get some food, and that was the last I saw her. The building collapsed within a few minutes. One beam fell on my legs and I was trapped. It was pitch dark and there was no air. I cried for my mother, but all I could hear were the cries of my colleagues. Several dead bodies were lying around me, and I spent my 2 days under the rubble craving water. I did not know when it was a day or when it was a night. It was all the same to me under the rubble, and they never found my mother's body. Sitting on the floor of a tin hut, like a baking oven in the summer heat. She says that after 8 operations, she is still unable to use her prosthetic limbs because they feel so heavy. Her husband has to carry her everywhere, including to the toilet. Nobody in her family earns any money now. I am stuck in this hut all day. I cannot go anywhere. What if something happens like a fire? What if no one is around? How am I going to live now? I quoted this whole section in full because I also think it really follows really well from from Corinne's presentation earlier, because of the ways in which I wanted us to feel the real materiality, the kind of like the naturalness or the normalness of an everyday slowly escalating into this kind of violent space, and the ways in which those narratives actually disappear from our kind of consideration of like even in terms of disability politics. So now I'm going to the last section then, which is Empire's Other. In feminist queer Crip, Alison Kafer calls feminist queer environmental theorists and activists to account for the ableism that is inadvertently or deliberately intertwined in their transgressive oppositional visions that for a future, oppositional visions for a future that explicitly or implicitly excludes the possibility of disability and comes at a huge cost to the disability community. She therefore thoughtfully asks, what does it mean to choose futures for disability? Kafer's question has been answered by legions of disability activists and scholars in disability pride parades, in vibrant disability justice movements, in the transgressive aesthetics of disability art, in the angry protests against the medical industrial complex, against incarceration in both prisons and institutions, against sterilization, against segregation in education, against nursing homes, and more recently, in the newly expanding scholarship and protests against neoliberal doctrines that are anathema to any claims for Crip futurity. But these protests should also give us pause, as in Rachel Gorman's blunt yet very thoughtful assertion that disability studies and Crip theory, similar to other social theories, have all inadvertently reconstituted the disabled subject as white subject, creating a disability rights consciousness that Gorman calls a kind of disability nationalism, similar to Jasbir Puar's critique of homo nationalism in the context of problematic racialization of queer politics. When allegiances do occur, disabled people are located at the crossroads of shifting identities. No, sorry, I don't know why today am I reading this thing. What allegiance do disabled people located at the crossroads of shifting identities have with a largely white middle-class disability rights movement in the global north? And what would our contradictions in the face of these real struggles enable us to, and how would our contradictions in the face of these real struggles enable us to imagine futures that do not rely on the exploitation and colonization of others? Or do we even care? Unfortunately, our tendency when accosted with disability is to move towards cure rather than care. In fact, it is rather hard to care in this context of neoliberal ableism implicated in the violence of empire. And I have 2 pictures that demonstrate violence of empire. In one case, there's a white man sitting in a kind of thing that's carrying him by 2 black people. He's in this, it's called a palanquin kind of thing. And the other one, there is a cartoon that says, the title is How Neocolonialism Works. And there are these 2 soldiers pointing a gun to 2 men in a kind of war-torn context, and says, Now that we've destroyed your country, you can pay us to rebuild it. We accept natural resources like oil as payment. So it's basically to kind of give you a succinct notion of what empire is. In fact, it is rather hard to care in this context of neoliberal ableism implicated in the violence of empire and its aftermath. Roland Coloma defines empire as not just a geopolitical entity, but also as an enactment of power in conjunction with colonialism, neocolonialism, and imperialism. According to Coloma, the imperialist, colonialist, and neocolonialist practices of empire enable metropolitan centers to continue to exert power over subordinate states, territories, and people in order to enable the expansion of their political power, the accumulation of financial capital through unequal trade and economic relations, the extraction of natural resources, cultural products, and colonized labor and bodies, and the imposition of metropolitan values, knowledges, and practices. What Coloma fails to note, and what is central to the functioning of empire, is the proliferation and the production of disability that I have described both ideologically and materially, mapping out transnational histories that spill over and seep across national borders and through racialized bodies marked by casual acts of violence. It is this casualness that normalizes this violence, justified via ideologies that are simultaneously both ableist, racist, gendered, and queered. For example, the casual penetration, quite literally, of empire into the most intimate spaces of those whose lives fall under its power was exemplified in the 1979 report of a virginity test administered at London's Heathrow Airport to an Indian woman seeking immigration into Britain to join her fiancé. What was brought to light after the justifiable uproar subsided was that virginity tests were a short-lived and extreme example of a series of practices to keep non-white immigrants from contaminating British society. As such, notions of access, I argue here, are already imbricated in racist, gendered, and ableist practices that are in turn implicated in the exploitative and relentless focus on profit by transnational capitalism. Hande and Kelly argue that in contemporary disability politics, issues of care are taken up via discourses of inclusion, accessibility, and daily living supports in ways that erase the material effects of living with disabilities. Issues of, I messed up. Issues of care have become a multi-million business such that, according to McCruer, disability has now become, and I quote, corporalized, destigmatized, identified, and integrated, in the terms like out and proud, into the circuits of global capital. And this has resulted in disabled bodies being placed involuntarily, and this is lots of Liat's work, into nursing homes and or state institutions and medicalized against their will, leading to the increased, and I quote, state securitization and incarceration of disabled bodies. These legacies of care are structured by exploitative and oppressive relations, from, and I quote, subtle coercions played out on the micro scale between disabled people and those who support them, to mass institutionalization of disabled bodies undertaken in the names of caring for people with disabilities, and this was a lot in Liat's work again, as well as the exploitative structures that coerce women, especially women of color, into what Nakano Glenn terms racialized gendered servitude. Adding to this rich body of work, I add another dimension to the discussion on care. The material conditions within which care is both constructed as an urgent need and the conditions under which it is meted out. I am arguing that in the blatantly unequal context, care is valorized within the context of consumption, where disabled tourists are involuntarily conscripted as profitable neoliberal subjects for transnational capitalism. Examining care via the productive relations of transnational capitalism takes on a distinctively imperialist neocolonial turn within the broader context of empire, if, or rather when, critical disability studies and Crip theory and other radical theories begin to engage the historical context where actual sites of care or the lack thereof become normalized sites of violence. For example, okay, something, sorry, I think I said maybe, yeah, sorry. For example, I call upon us to witness the brutality that barricades citizens behind the rubble in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, mediated by the tense relationships between Palestinian territories and Israeli settlements. Moreover, these normalized sites of violence, also known formally as national borders, become unremarked sites where the conditions for care, for care serve as an urgent need, conditions of care as an urgent need proliferate, with disability as a natural and normal outcome of such violent exclusion and differential access. A similar argument could be made when describing the US-Mexican border. And now we can also talk about the Haitian families huddled under a bridge in Houston, where unaccompanied immigrant children without documentation are being herded out of deplorable immigration detention centers where they had been earlier warehoused for deportation, even while being subject to unimaginable physical and emotional stresses. Another example of disability proliferation at the intersections of race, nation, imperialism, exploitative labor, antagonistic class relations, and profit. Here, once again, the discourse of care is bandied about as an argument against involuntarily incarceration that is not limited to the locale of prisons, asylums, nursing homes, and institutions, but should also include immigration detention centers, border control policies. Example C, Mansham Rizal's research on refugees and disability, and that are connected to the violent political economy of globalization that enables capital to cross borders with impunity, but not racialized labor. In these contexts, lack of care is not just a gross denial of one's human rights as global citizens, it is also an instrument of physical harm, disappearance, and even death. And I just have pictures of the border. In one case, there's like a clash of like soldiers, the military with people trying to cross a border. And the other one is just a bare sign of the border with a few kinds of the things that are left over, like objects that represent that people have been trying to cross it. In an essay, Decolonization is not a metaphor, Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang argue that settler colonialism is also rooted in a material violence that exceeds affect. They write, and I quote, "Many indigenous peoples have been forcibly removed from their homelands into reservations, indentured and abducted into state custody, signaling the form of colonization as simultaneously internal, via boarding schools and other biopolitical modes of control, and external, via uranium mining on indigenous land in the US Southwest and oil extraction on indigenous land in Alaska, with a frontier. The US military still nicknames all enemy territory in Indian country." Citing Dennis Childs, they argue that the slave ship and the plantation, and not Bentham's panopticon, as presented by Foucault, operated as spatial, racial, and economic templates for the subsequent models of coerced labor and human warehousing, as America's original prison industrial complex, unquote. Refusing the facile embrace of decolonization as metaphor, Tuck and Yang call for a rejection of all premature attempts at reconciliation. Instead, their demand is simple. Decolonization specifically requires the repatriation of indigenous land. To that, I would add, it also requires an end to oppressive and exploitative class relations that legitimize these epidemics of violence and violent epidemics. In honor of all those whose lives have been lost in the epidemics of violence and violent epidemics, I call on us all to actively work towards Crip futurity across borders, beyond metaphor, beyond affect, beyond innocence, and towards a kind of radical political economy of care. Thank you. And I apologize for all the glitches that happened. I have no idea. It was all me and it happened. So I apologize. And I will now stop sharing my. Oh.
Thank you so much. We have time for questions. Would anyone like to get us started?
I want to connect. Thank you so much. That was like amazing. I was like taking notes vigorously. Okay, so I have a question that might connect the two the two presentations, which is the kind of oscillation between, you know, disability, med pride, like reclaiming Crip spaces that Corinne was like talking about, right? Not just Crip spaces, but the orientation towards space, right? Like reclaiming what does it mean to be in the world in particular ways, and doing that in community, through community, and so on, that Corinne just discussed. And the kind of disability through violence or debilitation or pandemics of violence that you are describing, Nirmala. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the, you know, I'm often like sit in that, you know, intersection, right? I mean, how do you talk about disability pride to people in prison? How do you talk about disability pride to people in Palestine?
Yeah, right.
And I have a particular kind of answer to that question, but I'm much more interested in you all. I also wanted to give a shout out to a book that just came out, Lamar Jarrell's Birth book. And in it, he makes
It's on my table.
How to Go Mad Without Losing Your Mind. And in it, there's a chapter about the connection between Foucault and the Middle Passage. Not a chapter, a part of a chapter that I think is really fundamental to the kind of argument that you're making. So I just wanted to give a shout out. It just came out like a month ago.
Yeah, and it's on the pile of all the books that I have to read. And I'm very mad with disability studies theorists right now because they should slow down. That's all on writing. There was this whole thing about the slow professor, and they're not taking that up. But anyway, but yes, I mean, I want, like, a part of my intention is to particularly make us stay in that space of discomfort. It's not, I'm not here to resolve it, because it's also not resolvable. Like I kind of like tell that to my students too all the time. We have to remain at those contradictions. But remaining at those contradictions also then requires that which is why I kind of like ended on that the argument by Tuck and Yang on decolonization, because they say that it's not like they're talking about in the context of decolonization. It's not this is not metaphoric. For indigenous peoples, it is the repatriation of land. And in fact, they're making an argument for a real kind of very concrete materiality. I know it's almost impossible to do, but they're arguing that that's in fact the fundamental. And so it's really pushing us. Like, I think the argument I'm pushing here is for us to be not so comfortable with the fact that we are building solidarity. Like the lines of solidarity are, the argument actually I'm really making in a way is the lines of solidarity are very much constituted within the context of empire building, this is going to be like, I've been trying to pull it all together because this is going to be the title of my book, which I have to pull in all these different chapters. But I really want to show the ways in which both its disability at these intersectional contexts, which is very much at the heart of empire building. So we cannot, to talk about disability pride means also that we are really trying to then deconstruct. And that's why I loved Corinne's argument of the disorientation, disorientation would mean also disorienting. And that's why I think Kim's question was also really good in asking that, would mean how are we also thinking of orientations in the context of empire? That's where disability, pride, this notion of the Crip futures, as Kafer talks about, the ways in which McRuer also imagines this kind of, what he calls the severely Crip, critically queer, severely Crip positions. These are all the kinds of spaces where I really want us to, they're also very much part of the production of empire. And that's where also, Liat, your work, when you talked about institutions, that's the part, because empire has a way of incorporating it and producing it. Like we do allow Crip parades to occur, right? And they are guarded by police to keep us safe. The very police who beat up different groups of people, and the ways in which those narratives get taken up, and what empire means, and what the things we use to produce access, the orientations to produce access, are also produced in the violence of empire. So it's, for me, reminding us about the categories of those locations that it is. And that's why I like Puar's work too. Like I love the fact of Puar. I think I find Puar's work really powerful in taking us from this kind of pathological, very kind of clearly pathological understanding of disability in one sense, and moving it. I still have to read carefully the other books. So I'm not like, but I really think this notion of within what context, like I'm really talking about the context in which these arguments happen. So very long-winded answer. Yeah. I hope it answered kind of what you were asking, and maybe what were your ideas on it? Because I thought I would like to hear yours too, Liat. But not putting you on the spot, but because if you had wanted.
Corinne, did you want to take it first?
Sure, I can jump in. Actually, this was, I've been taking a lot of notes, and I'm thinking I actually really like that this is, I know other people will watch the talk later, but right now it feels very intimate.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. My thoughts was, I definitely took a note to what I've been thinking of in response to your talk, Nirmala, and your work in general. I've been thinking about maybe how something that's not conceptually clear in my paper is maybe the difference between a more kind of ontological sense of belonging in the world and a more social or political sense of belonging that is rooted in, materially situated communities. And so I think that's an interesting something definitely that I would need to emphasize, and that's certainly one of the risks with, I'm looking at Miranda Joseph's book right now on the romance of community, and thinking about, precisely all of these ways in which, movements of disability pride that are kind of labeled or sold as, or that appeal to a certain sense of Crip belonging, actually reinstate norms of whiteness, reinstate the, norms of class and gender and sexuality and nationality. And so, so yeah, I guess those are just my thoughts, kind of going off of what you just said, of that definitely this kind of all of the material and political dimensions that you're emphasizing are also part of these kinds of risks of community, or this kind of idealized notion of, we're just going to create Crip communities and everything's going to be really fantastic. So yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciated that, particularly that part. And part of it is also that because right now, that was just 2 days ago, some of you may, I was saying it on Facebook, I was actually at the school board, at a school board meeting. And so when we're talking about access, right? So from the critical Crip point of view, we talk about access as the ways in which these things are created to constitute and exclude disabled people. And I was arguing in the school board the ways in which education is constituted, right? Lack of access to education actually produces disabled bodies. I didn't say it in those terms, because Black in the title in the school my daughter goes to, which is a Title I school, Black and brown bodies are constituted as disabled and constructed as outside of the economy, right? So so talking about what like this notion of disorientation, but here it's the production of disability, and this is, I want to complicate it, because of one ways we are using access as a way to find meaningfulness in life. And in this case, it is an access that is constituting this disability. So there's the ways in which this is very, it just occurred to me while we were talking. So it wasn't something that I've actually articulated, but that now makes it really clear that I can already see another section, like drawing on all this work on the issue of what does it mean to be a political economy of access. Because in schooling, that's why when I was reading that, when I was talking about the example about the story in Bangladesh and the young woman there, like this notion of what access gets so much more complicated. It is in fact situated, produced, reproduced, and created so that and it also it also gets used, because that's some of my other work. I'm also saying how then the rhetoric of disability gets used to also justify this, so much so that when wealthy white parents in our school community did not want to wear masks and did not want virtual school, guess whom they talked about as people who were going to suffer the most? Disabled students. So here they were using the category of disability to argue for to argue for the fact that we were caring and so even disability and race, these and class get complicated in these modes of solidarity and care. So sorry, I talked too much.
Have to unmute myself. We have a little less than 5 minutes left. Are there any questions for the panel as a whole that anyone would like to get in before we finish up? Kim.
Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. If you don't want me to ask this question, it's okay. It's a question for Nirmala, not the whole panel. Is that?
Go ahead.
Is that okay? Yeah, fantastic. All three. I mean, this is a comment for all three presentations were great. Thank you so much. I am wondering if you could say more, because I've been thinking about this as well, about how you're that distinction between epidemics, pandemics, and endemics, right? Its place in the talk that you gave. Like, what is it that, I mean, as you're thinking about it, is it that, this is, as you said, this medical model that approaches violence? I'm just wondering if you could say more about that point, because I thought that was so important. Oh, now you're muted. It's a problem.
I had to take out, I was actually also going to do the stuff on Ebola, because I've actually written a piece on that, on Ebola, and before the pandemic, this pandemic, and now to bring it along with that and do the analysis. But it's like the ways in which we approach certain kinds of like this medical model, like right now, I'm sure we're all finding ourselves also in this context about, to get rid of this pandemic, let's think of it medically, and we can bring ourselves into that space to attract it. But we don't use this notion of this medical model, and yeah, I'm actually playing with that in some ways, when we are talking about the ways in which it becomes when it's socially and historically constituted. And because then if we talked about pathology, then we are talking about pathologizing systems. And then if we follow the medical model, that's the argument I'm trying to make then we would be called to destroy the vectors of the disease. But what I'm saying, so the argument I'm ultimately trying to make is we use the medical model and pathology in the context of the individual, in terms of certain kinds of bodies, like it's an embodied kind. We refuse to engage in terms of, which is what actually the disability studies, the social model of disability was in fact trying to do, was saying that where, like, even though, I mean, the most simplistic one is, when they're doing the disability impairment and disability thing, it was located in the systems and not so much in the bodies, which, I mean, there were issues with that. But in some ways I was using that kind of, I'm trying to use that kind of metaphor, that kind of logic to show the contradictions in the ways we talk about those terms. And that we sometimes buy into it in complicated ways too. Yeah.
Thank you so much to our panelists for participating in this inaugural panel on the philosophy of disability. It really was an honor to have you join us today. Also, thank you to our audience participants, both present and future, for those of you who are logging on electronically. Let's give everybody a Zoom clap for having a fantastic event for today. As we were closing up this event, the significance of this event really started to settle in for me. I realized that if I had gotten in a time machine and went back and visited my grad student self who attended SPEP and it said that this panel was happening, I probably wouldn't have believed you. So I think this is everybody here has their own relationship to philosophy and their own relationship to philosophy of disability, but I think that we can all kind of recognize that, as Liat said, like you only have the first time once. So thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for inviting us.
Bye.